Let's rank the robot skeletons, katana shards, and Gauss weapons in Warhammer 40k, with a tier list of Necrons units, which ones are looking strong and which ones less so. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a tier list for the Necrons, also known as a Necron tier list. So far in 10th edition, Necrons don't really seem to be in too bad a spot, perhaps not one of the single strongest factions in Warhammer 40k so far, but at least fairly solidly in the upper mid tier I think. A few really strong tricks and certain units that some armies just are really going to struggle to kill. In this video, as with a fair few of the other armies in Warhammer 40k, I thought we'd take a look through some of the strongest and weakest Necrons in the army, arranged into a rough tier list of power, starting with tier 5 the lowest and moving on to tier 1 the highest. The list is partially based on a community vote for strong and weak units and partially on my own opinions, the sort of things that have been cropping up in competitive lists really quite regularly or not doing so quite so much, and we'll go through the units one by one, roughly what they do, and where I think they weigh up in the power scale at the moment for the best things to include in a strong Necron army list. Obviously tier lists are always a little bit arbitrary. Certain units could fit certain armies better with different people's playstyles or the way that they like to play in the game, so they're always going to be a little bit rough and ready. But if you think they have ranked anything significantly too high or too low, feel free to let me know about it down in the comments. In any case though, let's jump into it and talk through every single unit in the Necron army. First up, in tier 5, I feel like these units are perhaps some of the weakest in the army, and perhaps least likely to be included in competitive lists regularly. Out of these ones, I think probably the strongest one is the Night Scythe perhaps, 145 points and a flying transport that needs to start in reserve now, what with 10th edition's rules in flyers without the hover mode. It means that under normal circumstances, typically you won't be able to arrive this thing until turn 2, and then not even get them out of your transport until turn 3. Though the Night Side does have some tricks of its own with its invasion beams, being able to basically scoop up Necron warrior squads that were already on the board maybe, and then teleport them from place to place as it flies about. Still though, I think even with that, it is a bit on the underwhelming side. You could maybe do some clever things with that, but I sort of feel like you're making effort just to make the Night Side work there, and otherwise it's not particularly outstanding, not enormous durability, and its locked flight path could cause some issues, as your opponent knows exactly where it's going to go. Maybe could have been tier 4 though, but I feel like it's another victim of flyer rules that don't work particularly well. Next up is the Necron Obelisk, 325 points for a great big titanic space pyramid, and kind of doomed to be a bit of an underwhelming unit, just with massive defense but not really doing a lot else. It can stack a lot of saves on light infantry with those Tesla spheres, they are all AP 0 though. It can slow down some units, and its durability is pretty good, as you'd expect as it doesn't really do loads else. Could be annoying enough to remove from midfield objectives perhaps, seeing as it does have a fairly decent objective control value, but I feel in general if you're putting 325 points into a unit you need it to be at least fairly dangerous, and I think that the Obelisk is going to get passed over in most armies. Next up for Necron characters, Trazen the Infinite really hasn't got any better in 10th edition, kind of a shame as he's quite a cool character in the lore and it would be nice to have him be a little bit more effective on the tabletop. His only real purpose in life at the moment is giving Necrons that sticky objective type rule, which is helpful enough but not really worth that amount of points, and otherwise he's basically just an overlord that has bad damage output and doesn't do the helpful stratagem things that overlords do. He still has that fun surrogate hosts rule where he can take over the bodies of other Necrons to perhaps keep them alive and on the table. But the issue with that is that just about every other Necron character that you have is probably going to bring more value than him. Without good damage output or particularly good buffing rule, you're probably just best off not replacing the character with Trazen, particularly as you have to do so before he even dies. Finally for tier 5 we've got the Convergence of Dominion, a spectacularly pricey fortification at 255 points. I feel like this one probably has a good argument to be perhaps the worst Necron unit, as for a price that's only slightly less than the Obelisk it does even less I'd say. They do have a little bit of close range shooting threat that could kill an elite infantry or two. They are fairly tough, but the reanimation protocols buff that seems to be the main draw to taking them just isn't really that exciting. You get to re-roll the dice whenever a unit makes a reanimation roll nearby, which is a rule that sounds kind of good, but it actually really doesn't add that many reanimated models to your army over the course of a game. Should usually be good for around about a third of a wound each time a unit makes a roll. Definitely very underwhelming for that points cost, could go down a fair bit, otherwise it's just a fortification unit that the opponent could pretty much ignore all game long and not really come to too much harm. Moving on though to units that are a bit more usable, here in tier 4 we've got units that do have a bit more of a purpose, though I think are generally overshadowed by one or another unit in the index. First up we've got the alternate build for the Obelisk, the Tesseract Bolt. 425 points, and a space pyramid with a 4+ invulnerable save that comes with Enslaved Catan, throwing out your choice of 3 fairly dangerous ranged attacks, including quite a fun, really big sniping one. It is fairly tough, a fair bit more dangerous, plus gets those Tesla spheres as well. Though still, despite the lack of the invulnerable save, I still think that the monolith wins out by the cost. The guns perhaps are a little bit scarier overall, plus it has its helpful things with being able to move Necron infantry units around, as well as having some combat threat and being cheaper. The Ophidian destroyers I think are a touch on the pricey side this time round, 110 points for 3 or 220 for 6. I think they just don't really have quite enough damage or defense for the cost, and just seem like they're a little bit pricey for a unit that could just be dedicated to doing actions and objectives and things, despite being able to burrow around and return to deep strike. Just seems that you might be better with units like cheap scarabs for that, as opposed to very pricey 110 point models that aren't really very tough. Their combat I think is okay, strength 4, AP 2 and damage 2 will certainly do well against certain targets, but it's really going to struggle against heavier infantry like Terminators. It definitely isn't as general purpose as the Scorpex though. Overall I think they're just a little bit on the overcosted side. A base unit could probably afford to lose 10 points or more. The Doomsire is another Necron flyer, but at least it can actually use its full damage output on the turn that it comes out, put it in reserve, and then arrive turn 2 for an Alpha Strike or an enemy tank. But despite the reserve limitations, it's just surprisingly costly. 225 points seems a lot for its damage output, and it does have to compete against a fair few other decent anti-tank weapons, things like the Doomstalker, Doomsday Arc, and the Locust Heavy Destroyers. Probably just not really worth the cost and inflexibility, plus again it's not really all that hard to kill, particularly for 225 points. The Triarch Stalker is at least a fairly cheap vehicle at 125 points though. Again, like in 9th edition though, it feels really quite underwhelming, even if you're using a very focused shooting army. Its range damage output is just generally underwhelming no matter what you choose, and kind of short ranged. And basically the idea is that it marks a target for the rest of your army to ignore cover against. That is a very helpful debuff in 10th edition. Could be useful enough if you've got a whole load of units that want to focus fire on one thing, but I feel like it's just probably not really worth the slightly lackluster damage that this guy has. Next up, we've got the Triarch Praetorians, the Jump Pack Guardians of the Silent King, 135 points for 5 or 270 for 10 of them. I feel like it's been a bit of a trend in 10th edition that Games Workshop has charged quite a lot for jump infantry, perhaps charged a bit higher these days due to how well they interact with terrain compared with fly vehicles. Their damage and defense I think is both kind of middling, a bunch of strength 5 and damage 2 attacks with the Rods of the Covenant, or going for the Swords and the Particle Casters, and I feel like they're perhaps a little bit disappointing with only a 9-inch movement as well. They are rather slow, and just overall for 27 points they just don't really do quite enough for the army. They're certainly a lot less exciting than a bunch of the other Necron units that you can field that can get good character buffs, perhaps particularly things like Lich Guard that you could build from the same kit. Not being able to have characters be attached to them in the Awakened dynasty seems a bit disappointing for them, given that it gives them so many extra options, plus there's quite a lot of good Necron support characters between the Cryptex and the Overlords. Next up, we've got the Psychomancer for 50 points. This guy's the Battleshock debuff Cryptech, and in general being the Battleshock debuff anything probably isn't a very strong start in 10th edition. Situationally helpful, but just not really reliably good. He gives you a -1 leadership aura, plus forces a Battleshock test for 1 unit in your turn, but this has very limited value as it's generally just going to be about stopping the enemy from using stratagems for the rest of the turn. Kind of sad that he's still a little bit underwhelming, as his model's very cool indeed. Compared with the raw extra damage that you get from the Plasmancer or the massive durability buffs that the other Cryptex give you, I think is rarely going to get taken. Finally for tier 4, I have chosen to rank literally all of the Necron Forge World units here as well. I feel like Games Workshop has perhaps pointed them at a level where they're just not going to be particularly exciting compared with the mainstay of the index, though perhaps not to the same extent where I'd rank them tier 5. The Tombstalker and Tomb Sentinel I both think feel kind of underwhelming for the damage and defense and just what they do in general. I guess at least somewhat tough with their 4+ invulnerable saves, but not really a lot of damage output. The Canoptic Acanthrites are perhaps one of the units that I think are most interesting out of them, 85 points or 170 for 6 of them. These guys can start in the midfield, so could be an alternative for flayed ones there if you want some infiltrators. They can move quite quickly as well with a 12-inch movement, which could make them annoying to get to certain places on the board or lock up enemies. And they do have a little bit of melter shooting and some combat, plus debuff a unit against some AP for some other Necrons units shooting them. Overall, I think for the cost, I'd still probably rank flayed ones a little bit better, but I think that these guys could be usable in small numbers for paying a premium for points on midfield objectives. The Seraptech Heavy Construct I think I might have rated a bit higher, but then Games Workshop cranked up the points cost on it. It got caught with really quite a big nerf alongside the Imperial Knights and things, and I feel like that makes it a bit more underwhelming. And finally, the Tesseract Arc I think has okay damage output, but again just not particularly exciting. The main gun's okay and I suppose quite generalist, but again I feel it competes fairly badly with a lot of the other Necron choices that you have access to. I'd say all of them aren't so bad that you couldn't use them, but I'd be kind of surprised to see any of them appear too regularly in competitive lists. Maybe the Acanthrites could be an interesting utility choice though. Moving on, we're up into Tier 3 now. Units I think that are a little bit stronger than the latter, solidly usable units for the Necrons, but again maybe a little bit more niche uses compared with the stuff that are ranked in Tiers 1 and 2. Out of this list, I'd say that perhaps one of the best units might be the Death Marks. 65 points for 5 of them and 130 for 10. Not really too bad given that they've got the same stats as an Immortal, but also arguably have a better gun with a Strength 5 and Damage 2. They could also be quite a cheap unit for deep striking for trying to get secondary objectives and things, and if the opponent does have some characters for them to hunt, they do have at least fairly good damage output against them. Lighter support characters really shouldn't be all that hard to pick up, and that could be very disruptive for the opponent's army. I think just for being a cheap unit and having some actually genuinely quite good sniper damage, I could have happily ranked them tier 2 for a bit of interference. Next up we've got the Necron Shock Melee Elite with the Scorpec Destroyers, 110 points for 3 or 220 for 6 of them. I think that these guys have had a bit of a come down since 9th edition, where they were perhaps one of the mainstays of the Necron Melee, perhaps a bit more outcompeted for that role by Lichguard now. They still bring a whole flurry of big Plasma Blade attacks though, with Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage 2, plus the Plasma Sight to get them devastating wounds for a turn, which could be nice against heavier stuff. They're at least relatively sturdy, with Toughness 6, a 3+ save and 3 wound bodies as well. Still solid enough for a frontline brawler, and at least the reanimation protocols might be a little bit more useful to them, as the old one was very weak with multi-wound models. Next, for 75 points or 150 for 2, we've got the Canoptek Spider. This thing I think is just a fairly strong all-rounder that you could maybe use a little bit differently in different matchups. I think it brings quite a lot of interesting buffs to the table, plus also has its own okay shooting and melee damage, even if it's not standout. For actually killing things it seems best with the spammed anti-infantry particle blasters, particularly if they get the blast keyword against a big ranked up squad, could be getting quite a lot of hits there with devastating wounds. Otherwise, I think the Gloom Prism's quite an interesting one to have in the mix to counter psychic armies, perhaps if you get taking a lot of psychic damage from Thousand Suns or Tyranids maybe. Plus he also helps out nearby vehicles with a 6+ Feel No Pain type save, which isn't huge but it's also not nothing, perhaps particularly nice if you're running something like a Monolith or a bunch of Doomsday Arcs or something. He can repair some Scarabs as well, though I sort of feel like that's a bit of a secondary thing, and you generally don't want to be fielding masses and masses of them for the most part, though he certainly could help regenerate you a few. Probably not a unit to go too heavily on, but just one for a whole bunch of utility seems handy enough, and its damage for 75 points isn't terrible. Moving on, we've got the Flayed ones, 70 points for 5 of them, or 140 for 10. These guys get to set up in the mid-board and are a fair bit more dangerous in melee than they were previously, quite good at bullying light and medium infantry. 70 points isn't too terrible for a unit to start on a mid-board objective, maybe hide out of line of sight, and with their damage they certainly could be a pretty decent threat to small units of enemy infantry for a first turn charge. Perhaps their biggest downside is they're not really all that hard to kill. They do have stealth for a little bit of protection against enemy shooting, but they're still not very tough per model. Maybe having 1 or 2 small units to screen could be alright. Might be a little bit risky to go too heavily on them though. If your opponent gets first turn they could be killed quite quickly. Next up, for 110 points for 3 of them, we've got the Wraiths. They're perhaps competing with the Scorpec Destroyers for a role, a slightly faster moving, close range and combat threat. The Wraiths have a little bit less attack power with their lower AP and lower strength, but get a bit more defense with a 4+ invulnerable save on top of a similar sort of 3 wound profile. They do get a little bit of close range shooting, either with anti-infantry particle blasters or some damage 3 strength 4 attacks. Again though, I'd say they're usable but not super standout for their cost, handy enough to have in the battle line, but maybe not going to carry anything much above their points weight. The Annihilation Barge is quite a cheap little Necron skimmer for 115 points. The Tesla Cannon gets a whole bunch of spammed shots with twin-linked AP0 and damage 2, and the double exploding 6s for Tesla, plus it gives you a small chance to get some scattered mortal wounds to enemy units near its primary target. It does have quite good range, so isn't a terrible unit for stacking a bunch of volume attacks on one enemy target. At least in 10th edition, things with a 3+ save won't be going into a 2+ save due to cover, due to the core rule in the 40k rulebook. Definitely not terrible volume fire, but I think most lists might be a bit more tempted to take something that can also deal with heavier things like heavy infantry and threaten tanks a little more. AP0 will hurt against a fair few targets. Next, we've got the Catan Shard of the Deceiver for 265 points. He still perhaps seems one of the less interesting Catan shards, particularly as he's virtually the same cost as the rest of them now, though he does have his merits. He's harder to take down than most of them, having stealth innately, so a -1 to hit at range. His close combat is actually very good at killing elite infantry. Flat damage 3 means that he's quite efficient against things like Terminators. Then for his special rule, he allows you to redeploy 3 units. I'd say that's fairly helpful, though you only get to do it before first turn, not after, so you can't set up things with perfect knowledge of whether you're going first. And his ranged attack is a somewhat good sniping one, useful against certain armies a bit more than others. Overall, I don't really think that he's all that bad, to be honest. He does bring a fair amount of things that the others don't, but I feel like people are going to be more tempted by the other ones at the moment, either the Transcendent for big durability, the Void Dragon for countering vehicles in a big way, or just the raw might of the Nightbringer. Next up, we've got Zarek the Silent King, kind of auto-include for a large amount of 9th edition, though perhaps falling on hard times a little bit in 10th. 470 points is quite a big points increase, and his buffs just don't really go quite as far as they used to. Maybe the most reliably useful one is re-rolling hits and wounds of 1 at range. Seems handy to have in the middle of a Necron gun line, plus that will help with his own shooting as well, which is fairly potent. Those big Annihilator beams, plus different shooting from his day's attacks. He also cancels Battle Shock as well and has some decent combat. I think when he's pretty much literally a quarter of your army at 2,000 points though, he probably is a little bit too pricey for what he does for most armies. Plus those Mynir's rules as written at the moment have got a small chance of just exploding like small nuclear bombs. It's got Deadly Demise D6 plus 2, which would be pretty savage if they do happen to go up next to the rest of your Necron army. Next, we've got the Catacomb Command Barge at 150 points. He's a light skimmer that can be directly shot, though at least he gets a -1 to wounds if he's being shot by heavy stuff. Still a little bit unfortunate for a character unit to be directly targeted by heavy guns though. He gives out an aura of +1 objective control, so helps make your units a little bit more indomitable in taking points in the midfield, and he also brings a unit agnostic resurrection orb as well, allowing you to trigger that in both the enemy turn and your turn for 1 unit nearby. I think it's usable enough, but there's really quite a lot of competition for Necrons to lead your army, and there's quite a lot of units that you can put in squads with good protection that can't be shot directly. The Scorpet Lord I'd rate around about the same sort of level as Scorpet Destroyers. If you're running them, he seems like an okay choice to lead them. He gives the Scorpex lethal hits in melee, which does help them punch up against bigger targets quite well, plus has his own mortal wound threat and his own combat profile with a big strength 10 and damage 3. He is fairly tanky as well, and could be quite an interesting one to try and return to life with the Protocol of the Eternal Guardian stratagem as well. Having him stand up in the middle of the enemy army could cause some issues, getting his choice of what he wants to shoot and charge next turn, hopefully. Imitate the Stormlord is one that I was debating putting in between tier 3 and tier 2. The main thing that he brings is very good indeed with his Grand Strategist special rule, meaning that you generate an extra command point if he's on the battlefield. That's pretty near worth to the price of inclusion just by itself. The Necron stratagems are really quite good, and this will allow you to use more of them. But otherwise he just doesn't really do anything for the squad that is leading bar his own personal profile. He does have some okay shooting and okay melee, but nothing outstanding I'd say, and a once per game mortal wound attack that he does need to get at least fairly close for it to do anything much. Definitely very usable if you can find a squad for him. It doesn't look like he's anywhere near mandatory in competitive Necron lists though. Despite fairly godly command point generation, quite a lot seem to leave him at home. Just with the choices of other excellent characters to lead squads around, and Imitate might not quite make the cut. Next up, we've got Amrakir the Traveller for 95 points. I think again he's interesting enough. He gives Immortals a +1 to wounds, so if you did want a damage strategy built around them, then he could be interesting enough. I guess maybe if you wanted to give him even more damage, you could combine him with a Plasmancer perhaps. I think perhaps his biggest issue is that he's locked to leading the Immortals as opposed to the Lich Guard or Warriors, which usually tend to be the units that people want to build around a little bit more in Index Necrons. Huge units with loads of tankiness and massive regeneration on the Warriors, or the big chunky defense and melee threat of the Lich Guard. Finally for this tier we've got Nemensor Zandrek and Vargard Oberon, both of which are 85 points and can be attached to the same unit. Oberon gives you fights first in combat, which is pretty nice in 10th, allowing you to say have a Lich Guard unit that fights before the enemy even if they're charged, and chips in with his own few precision warside melee attacks as well. Zandrek has one of those rules that allows you to get +1 command points for an enemy stratagem all game long. That could be quite a big deal if they've got something that they're just likely to be using turn on turn. He has his own stats with a Staff of Light, and then gets a somewhat random leader buff for his unit each turn, which sometimes could be very helpful, sometimes could overlap with their weapons that they have already, say gaining lethal hits on Gauss that already has it, for example. I think they do bring some pretty interesting stuff. The command point increase is handy, and then having, say, a unit of Lich Guard with fights first and one of those 3 random buffs seems useful enough, but they are quite pricey for the pair of them at 170 points overall. Moving onwards and upwards, here are the units that I rate as fairly strong Necron units, perhaps a little bit more likely than most to crop up in stronger Necron army lists. I'd say that all of these are solidly usable, but maybe just might be a little bit more niche compared with the stuff that are ranked in Tier 1, some of the more standout good Necron things. First up, we've got the Locust Destroyers, 30 points each to a maximum of 6 of these guys. Fairly cheap and efficient firepower with those Gauss cannons at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, fairly good at clearing enemy elites, and they're quite good with the reroll to wound stratagem that you can get if they can get up close and personal to their target. I think that these guys will be used really quite a lot more if the Locust Heavy Destroyers weren't quite as efficient as they are, though I feel like they probably outcompete them for the most part right now. I think they're still really quite solid for Space Marine killing though. The Ghost Ark I think is a solid transport for 125 points, fairly cheap and fairly tough for a transport with 14 wounds and its 4+ invulnerable save. It can move up into the midfield, drop off 10 warriors and maybe even an attached character now into the fray, and then when the units are there in the midfield, they'll make them reanimate a little bit better with a bit of a reactive reanimation rule to get more models back when you're shot. Just that rule alone is kind of interesting to include in the army, could make it really quite valuable to have near bigger Necron warrior units nearby as well, never mind the smaller unit that it's transporting. Overall it's got really quite a nice durability rule, pretty tough itself, and chips in with a bunch of Gauss flares if the enemy gets too close. Next for 385 points we have the Necron Monolith, a big tanky Necron super heavy with towering with some solid midfield shooting. It's got its particle whip which is quite general purpose, and then usually 4 death rays to back it up, with some fairly good anti-tank shots. It's quite tough against most standard anti-tank with toughness 14, things like las cannons will be wounding it on a 5+. Its combat really isn't too bad either with a Portal of Exile, should be able to kill a good few medium infantry with that at the very least, and it can be kind of helpful for nearby Necron infantry as well, giving them a few movement tricks with its Eternity Gate, potentially pulling them out of combat and having them phase to the Monolith, where they can take the fight to the enemy anew. It's maybe a little bit of a pricey Necron centerpiece, though I think it's usable enough. A tough unit to move up into the midfield and force the opponent to deal with it, give you some interesting redeploys, and absorb a whole bunch of fire. Next, for 125 points, we've got the Canoptek Doomstalker. These things have got a lot more strong and reliable anti-tank firepower now, strength 14 with a heavy keyword for hitting on a 3+, and more reliable flat damage 3 that is a lot more useful against elite infantry, and d6+1 shots and the blast keyword with a potential for a few more. I think their toughness is okay as well with the 4+ invulnerable save that they get and 12 wounds. I say these things might just be a little bit outcompeted by their bigger brother the Doomsday Arc, though realistically I don't think there's a huge amount in it. The Doomstalker also has the advantage of getting a 5+ Overwatch as well, if you desperately need, say, 1 or 2 anti-tank hits like that to finish something important off. Next we've got the Canoptek Scarab Swarms, 40 points for 3 of them, or 80 for 6. These guys don't really do a whole load in terms of their own damage right now. They do have lethal hits that should put at least a couple of AP0 saves on their target though. But just in general, little cheap units of fairly fast moving swarms are fairly handy for things like tactical objectives in 10th edition, or just doing other grunt work like screening and move blocking, or just doing nuisance charges on the enemy. They can't help too much with primary objectives having OC0, though I guess potentially if you get -1 objective control for a unit that they're with, that could be handy enough I guess, but I feel like in general it's the other things that are going to carry them a bit more. One can self-destruct as well for some mortal wounds if that makes sense against your chosen target. Occasionally just a few mortal wounds might well be worth it against big, tough and armoured foes. It is kind of interesting that they have Deadly Demise as well, the potential for causing a little bit of carnage if they blow up in the enemy lines and you roll that lucky 6. Definitely not a unit to have en masse I think, but a couple of them running around and just being a nuisance I think is handy enough. Next up we've got the Immortals, 70 points for 5 of them or 140 for 10. Basically slightly raised warriors with a better save and slightly better damage output, though maybe not quite the raw durability or the ability to mass up in big 20-man bricks to get better efficiency from characters. Could be useful enough for a slightly lower investment squad to try and take objectives, They do get a nice rule with reroll wound rolls against enemies that are taking points, but I think for the most part, with just the sheer amount of strength that you can get in the unit and its maximum size, you might well be better off building around either warriors or Lich Guard instead. Still doesn't seem terrible to buff them with characters though, or you could just run them as smaller, cheaper units to skirmish on objectives rather than just go all in with massive stat character buffs. And if you wanted to use Anric here, I guess they're the squad for him as well. Next up, for 80 points for 3, we've got the Tomb Blades. Necron Scouting Bikers, now with a 3+ save as they get their shield veins included, a -1 to hit, and then your choice of either a 5+ invulnerable or ignoring cover with their anti-infantry guns. Again, they're a unit that's trading off a bit with their damage and defense versus their speed, but with Scouts 9 inches, they do have the potential to be a bit of a nuisance. Again, move blocking early or jumping into table quarters and doing tactical objectives like that. Again, a unit that could be okay to have in small numbers, though I probably wouldn't go trying to make them work as big main damage dealers. Next, the Catan Shard of the Nightbringers, 255 points. All the Catan are pretty tanky with their high toughness values and halving damage characteristics, and the Nightbringer is one of the ones that just brings a massive amount of raw might, big anti-tank style shooting with Gaze of Death, powerful general purpose melee with devastating wounds, and even more mortal wounds as it drains life at the end of the fight phase. Hard to go too far wrong with a bunch of direct damage like that, but I feel like it might just be a little bit behind the Transcendent and the Void Dragon. Both of those I think are really quite standout at the moment. Otherwise, for characters that are ranked in Tier 2, Illuminor Seraz I think could have been one that could have arguably been up in Tier 1 perhaps. He's 220 points for a fairly tanky character with a 4+ Feel No Pain, really quite good personal defense, and a bunch of Strength 9 and Damage 3 attacks. Definitely could be a problem for enemy units with Lone Operative. It's not going to be too easy to kill unless you can get quite close to him, provided he's got any other Necrons units nearby. He's really quite powerful to have in the midst of a battle line as well. His augmentations mean that you get more AP on your battle line infantry shots. Things like those Gauss Flares and Reapers will be a lot scarier. Plus enemy AP is worse against them as well. Perhaps particularly nice for things like units of Immortals or Warriors with the benefit of cover perhaps. They'll be getting some very high saves against enemy shooting. I think both his personal stats and the buff and debuff really are quite strong, but he also is very expensive at 220 points as well. And if you are taking him, probably a character that you need to build around quite a bit, stacking up quite a lot of value in big unkillable warrior or immortal blobs. Definitely pretty strong. Maybe could have been a candidate for tier 1, though I do think he is a little bit on the pricey side, probably to the extent where he's not auto-included versus more leader characters in units. The Plasmancer has got way better in 10th edition, 55 points to buff shooting with 5+ criticals for Gauss and Tesla, solid buffs to both of those, more auto wounds or more sustained hits too. On top of that, he also has quite a lot of threat himself, a big anti-horde mortal wound attack that he really wants to put into big squads if he can reach them, plus a good few shots at strength 7, AP 3 and damage 2 at range, and a couple more in combat. Overall, I think he's really quite an efficient buffing character, definitely going to make a Necron squad a lot more dangerous and nice to have buried in a unit of warriors perhaps. I think his main issue though is that he's competing against the durability cryptex for the slot, and they just have absolutely outstanding value. Still though, very usable, and I do like his rules a lot. Next up, for 85 points and quite cheap for a Destroyer Lord, is the Locust Lord. Again, he gives you 5+ critical hits with the Destroyers. You can either take him with the regular Locust ones or with the heavy ones, where you could get more sustained hits for those M-Mythic Exterminators. Probably a bit better with either the Gauss Locusts or the M-Mythic Heavies. I don't think he's going to be quite as good with the really big Gauss cannons that the Heavies get. It's just a little bit less important that they auto-wound, seeing as they'll often have a good chance to do so anyway. Otherwise, besides the shooting buff, he can also bear a Resurrection Orb as well, so the unit will regenerate a lot quicker than it otherwise would. Quite nice in a ranked up Locust unit perhaps. He's fairly tough in his own right if his squad does get shot down, and then he's got a little bit of personal threat with his own melee or Staff of Light. Seems handy enough either leading 3 heavies or 6 Locusts, I'd say. Finally for this tier, we've just got a couple of the cheaper leader characters. The regular Lord is 65 points, and again he gets a Resurrection Orb if you want one. I think that alone makes him a very interesting character, regenerating models both in your turn and the enemy's, and then also adding his War Scythe, +1 to move, and using stratagems even if battle shocked. I think for a first choice for a Necron block, the Overlord's generally going to outcompete him. 20 points for the boosted stat line and 3 stratagems seems well worth it. but he's perhaps a good secondary choice to the Overlord if you've already got one somewhere, as he can't use that stratagem ability more than once. If you want another big super block with a Resurrection Orb, then the Lord could be one way to get that. Otherwise, the Royal Warden's 40 points. He's a very cheap leader indeed, and not bad for an army that gives +1 to hit for leaders. And then I think he's at least potentially interesting for things like Warriors or Immortals, given their weapons both the Heavy keyword and the Assault keyword. The Assault one's particularly nice for the Gauss Reapers and trying to get them in range with their shorter 12-inch range. Though the Heavy keyword is maybe a little bit underwhelming, seeing as he already gives his squad +1 to hit. I guess it could be relevant against things like stealth. He also has a single cancel battle shock ability once per game, not the worst to have a little bit of insurance against that built in, though a lot of the time that might not be a factor at all. I think the Assault keyword plus the leader +1 to hit and the access to better stratagems could well be worth it at 40 points, plus he chips in with a little bit of personal shooting as well, so he's not just dead weight in the unit, chipping in with that Relic Gauss Blaster. For most units though, I feel like he might face some fairly stiff competition from the Cryptex. Finally, we get into the really good stuff, Tier 1 and the things that I'd rate as top tier Necron units right now, perhaps some of the units that are most likely to feature in top tournament lists. First up, perhaps one of the biggest and baddest Necron units to build around are the Lich Guard, 95 points for 5 of them, so perhaps surprisingly cheap at just 19 points per model, or 190 for 10. I've seen quite a lot of lists making good use of multiple big squads of these guys buffed with characters. They themselves have got a very good defensive profile indeed, 2 wounds at toughness 5 with a 3+ save, and in most competitive lists just about everyone takes the sword and shield as opposed to the war scythe, the 4+ invulnerable save, and mass AP2 damage 1 combat. From there they're pretty ideal to buff with multiple characters. Putting a noble in the unit will give them a -1 to wound as well, so extra tankiness there. A particularly popular choice is the Technomancer for feel no pain on the 2 wound models, plus healing injured ones, and then maybe an Overlord for stratagems with a Resurrection Orb, a free stratagem every turn, and then getting more of them back up from the dead, as well as his own combat stats. Overall, really quite an intimidating unit to be marching straight up into the mid-board with. Very hard to take down with combinations of invulnerable saves, feel no pains, and -1 to wound, never mind the fact that they're likely to be just standing straight back up as you kill them. In combat, some units are just going to bounce against them, and they'll be able to cut them down over the course of a few turns with attrition combat. Next up, and perhaps some of the best fire support in the Codex right now, are the Locust Heavy Destroyers, 45 points each, with 1 to 3 in the unit, really quite cheap considering that the standard Locusts are 40. Their durability I think is still okay for that points cost, toughness 6, a 3+ save and 3 wounds, and regrowing chip damage with reanimation protocols as per standard. Still maybe not a unit that you want right on the front line, but not super easy to kill either. In 9th edition, I think it was all about the big Gauss weapons, but now Games Workshop have buffed the M-Mythic Exterminators as well, to the extent where I think that both guns are very credible. Either massive anti-tank shots with the Gauss with a huge damage of 6, or up to 12 M-Mythic Exterminator shots that are really quite good anti-horde with a bit of AP. Maybe could be an interesting unit for getting the +1 to hit with the Sovereign Coronal for nearby units, or perhaps including a Locust Lord in them if you're taking the M-Mythics perhaps. Overall very strong fire support. It seems to be at least a fairly common choice to have multiple biggish units in competitive lists. Next up, we've got the Canoptek Reanimator for 95 points. This guy wants to be sitting somewhere fairly central in the Necron army, ideally not getting shot too much by the enemy, though at least he has a 4+ feel no pain to keep him safe now. But his rule is that whenever Necron reanimation protocols trigger within 12 inches of him, they regenerate an extra D3 wounds, which is absolutely massive. It might be a little bit more passable if the only way to reactivate animation protocols was in the Necron's own command phase, but seeing as you can do it in the enemy command phase with a Resurrection Orb, and in the enemy turn with both a stratagem and maybe a Ghost Arc as well, the sheer amount of extra wounds that a Reanimator can pile back on could easily be worth the points very quickly. It's definitely a key factor in making certain Necron units like the Lich Guard or the Warriors just very problematic and hard to kill, particularly with those reactive reanimation type things, where the enemy shoots them and a bunch get up immediately, either with a stratagem or maybe the Ghost Arc. Again, for making reanimation blocks even more tanky, the Cryptothralls are well worth an include alongside a Cryptek. 40 points for this little pair of murder buckets here. 2 wounds each with a 4+ feel no pain, so more durable than your average Necron. Add more weight to the unit, and you can easily tank damage on these guys first, and then have these guys be the first to reanimate again, being again harder for the enemy to kill. Very nice to attach these guys to Necron Warriors or some Lich Guards to give your enemy even more durable bodies to try and slog through. Plus they do have a little bit of a shooting and combat profile of their own, which they will be able to chip in with. Next we've got the Necron Warriors, 120 points for 10 of them, or 240 for 20. These guys come armed with either the Gauss Flares or Gauss Reapers. Probably the Reapers are the slightly more threatening and more dangerous profile with Strength 5 and AP -1. I think that is worth taking despite the shorter range. Warriors get their huge reanimation potential with D3+3 models restored each time they activate reanimation protocols, provided they can get themselves within range of an objective marker at least. And as mentioned quite a lot throughout the video already, they're a good place that you can put all sorts of buffs on to make them reanimate better, and are just a massively tanky block that you could potentially have standing on a midfield objective. The opponent shoots down most of the unit, and they just all spring back to life in the Necron player's turn. Nothing short of absolutely overwhelming firepower is really likely to wipe them, provided you've got some other durability buffs going. They're definitely a bit lackluster on the damage output front, and not really going to do all that much besides against light infantry, perhaps particularly if the enemy does tag them in combat in something, as then they won't be able to fire with their Gauss Reapers. Still though, just for putting an absolute ton of objective control on a central objective, they can be a real problem for some opponents. More Necron firepower next in the Doomsday arc, 185 points for perhaps the premier Necron anti-tank choice. Really big threat on this one, with D6+1 shots at strength 15, AP 4 and damage 4, with devastating wounds and +1 to hit if it chooses to stay still. Again, I think this one's tanky enough with its 14 wound profile with a 4+ invulnerable save. Quite a lot of longer range weapons that are going to be threatening it might be big anti-tank weapons with loads of AP, and they certainly won't like the 4+. Really quite cool that the main gun is kind of living up to its name a bit more now. It was definitely a bit random in 9th. And it's also really quite good that it can actually move and fire pretty credibly, even if you do pass up the devastating wounds for it. If the enemy does get too close as well, then the Gauss Flares can do quite a number on infantry, quite a lot of rapid fire shots coming out of them there. Next up we've got the last two flavours of Catan, the Transcendent Catan and the Catan Shard of the Void Dragon, 280 points for the Transcendent and 270 for the Void Dragon. I think the Transcendent might be a little bit more on the tame side, by the fact that you can give it the Necron enhancement, the Sempiternal Weave. The rest are all epic heroes, but the Transcendent is not, and that means that you can give it enhancements and upgrades and things, and this makes it just absolutely spectacularly durable. Toughness 11, 12 wounds, a 4+ invulnerable save, halving damage, and then basically halving it again by that 4+ feel no pain. Almost nothing is going to be particularly efficient against this guy, and he can soak up an enormous amount of fire. I'm really not too sure whether it's an intentional thing that he should be able to take that. I feel like it looks like it might be more of a mistake that Games Workshop didn't think about. The datasheet is a bit weird as well, in that he doesn't have the reanimation protocols that the rest of the Catan do as well. Not sure if it's one that just has a couple of errors on maybe. In any case, in its current state, it's enormously tanky if you take that enhancement. It's got fairly general purpose shooting and melee with a bunch of mid-strength and high damage attacks, and it's also got a special trick to teleport itself around the board as well. If it advances, then it gets to teleport somewhere, and it can still fire its seismic assault when it does so. Could be fairly terrifying to have that massive threat teleport into the enemy backfield, maybe take a big chunk out of a support unit holding an objective, and proceed to be a big problem from there on in. Otherwise, for the Void Dragon, he's just got a very general purpose and nastily threatening profile both at range and in melee. A bunch of his attacks get anti-vehicle 2+ and a huge damage d6+2, so should be a bit of a terror against armies like knights, but he is actually pretty efficient against lighter infantry as well, getting a whole bunch of hits with his Voltaic Storm at range with sustained hits 2 and damage 2. And then in combat he's got quite a general purpose threat, can be hitting vehicles very hard, or he can go for 16 fairly high quality anti-infantry attacks. With so many armies using vehicles at the moment though, he seems like really quite a nice counter-meta choice. If he's against them as well, he can also rip a bit of health out of them. In his shooting phase he has a 2+ chance of dealing D3 mortal wounds to a nearby vehicle, and then healing the same amount himself. While armies like knights are quite strong, I feel like this guy will be too. Next up, we've got perhaps the signature leader of the Tomb World in the Necron Overlord, 85 points and really quite a strong character to be leading either Lich Guard or Warriors. He's got one of those captain style rules that allows you to use a free stratagem on the unit each turn. Could be handy for that reactive reanimation one perhaps, but there's plenty of other very strong ones for the Necrons, all of which are generally better if characters are leading a unit. He also bears the Resurrection Orb as well, which we've already talked about quite a bit. Both turn reanimation is definitely going to punish the opponent for leaving the unit standing, and on top of that he's got a fairly tanky profile. can use that resurrection stratagem if he dies, which could be a good use of one, and if the squad does get mixed up in combat, he could chip in with a bit of melee with his strength 10 and damage 3 void scythe. That could be helpful enough if a big Necron warrior squad does get tangling up in combat with the foe. Overall, very nice all around. I think that one of those is very tempting to have somewhere in your army. Next up, we've got the Hexmark Destroyer for 80 points. Again, this is a unit that got way more interesting with the 10th edition rules. It gets lone operative and strikes with a flurry of damage 1 precision attacks, so at least a fair chance of sniping out some characters within enemy units. It also gets a free Overwatch attack that hits on a 2+ against the target, so basically a free round of shooting if the enemy comes too close in their turn. And pretty much biggest of all is the option to return fire literally every time a friendly unit gets shot within 3 inches. So you could have this guy behind a big unit of Necron warriors or Lich Guard. They'll be tanking a lot of fire as the Necrons can't quite reach the hex mark, and then every single time they target that unit, this guy can open fire on enemy units getting too close to them, maybe about to attempt a charge. If the enemy army is doing perhaps the most sensible thing and focusing loads and loads of fire on the Necron units to try and bring it down entirely, then the hex mark might get quite a lot of reactive shooting. Really quite a nasty little character to have hiding in the ranks, and could be a good option for bearing that Sovereign Coronal enhancement as well. Quite good to have that one on an independent lone operative unit, where it doesn't have to just follow a squad around and can't be directly targeted at long range at all. Finally, and finishing with perhaps some of the most efficient units in the book, are the Durability Cryptex, the Technomancer, Chronomancer, and Orokin the Diviner. Out of these guys, perhaps the single best value might be out of the Technomancer at 60 points. He gets his 5+ Feel No Pain type save, plus healing a model each turn. He seems like perhaps the one to go for if you want to make a bunch of Lich Guard really tanky. Their 2 wounds absolutely love the 5+ Feel No Pain type save, particularly against things like damage to weapons. He can then either have fly with his Canoptech cloak or take a Canoptech control nose to buff nearby Canoptech things, and he has a little bit of his own threat with his Staff of Light as well, though I think for the most part is justifiable just with his durability boost alone. Otherwise, I think the Chronomancer is another very strong option, only 50 points, so super cheap for this guy. His Time Splinter Mantle gives you a -1 to hit for the unit, and that functions in both range and in melee. It might be a little bit better of a durability buff for say something like a big massed up Necron warrior squad, as a lot of multi-damage weapons might make the Feel No Pain a little bit redundant. Seems fairly similar value overall against a lot of shooting that's going to be coming in at you. And plus he also gives his unit a move shoot move. The second move is only 5 inches, but that could lead to a Necron unit getting really quite a lot closer to the enemy. Lich Guard further up the board if they can't make a charge this turn, or Necron warriors perhaps really quite safely onto a midfield objective right from turn 1 due to basically getting 2 movement phases. Overall remains quite a lot of value for 50 points. Finally, Orokin the Diviner I think is also good value at 80 points. He gives a 4+ invulnerable save to his unit, and that's absolutely amazing for warriors who have the 4+ save to start with. Basically a warrior unit that doesn't really have to care too hard about AP coming at them. Otherwise though, he feels like he's a little bit of a hidden Necron assassin within the unit, as once per game you can decide that these stars are right, or he can goes into rage mode for a turn, getting 6 attacks at strength 12, and every wound that you get gets D3 devastating wounds. That could easily be something like 6 or 7 mortal wounds on an infantry target when he fights, which I think is really quite massive for 80 points inside say a unit like warriors that can't fight too hard, even if it is only once per game. Overall I think that all of these 3 bring some pretty spectacular value to the units that they're leading, and really play in with the whole buffed reanimation protocols thing, making the unit really hard to kill, so you've got more chance of getting models back next turn when it survives to reanimate, and any of those reanimated models are still going to be hard to kill again. In any case, that's just about it for Index Necrons and the units within. Hope you've enjoyed a little bit of discussion as to how the units are shaping up in the new game of 40k. Let me know your thoughts on these, including any ones that you'd rank particularly high or low compared with how I've ranked them on the tier list. Look forward to hearing your ideas down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and I'm sure we'll have more for the Necrons in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.